I'm Marc Nivet, Chief Diversity Officer for the Association of American Medical Colleges. Welcome to our Diversity 3.0 Learning Series. We are very pleased to bring you this set of online resources, a source of insight from experts in the field on a range of issues which you tackle day to day. We've created these resources to help you leverage diversity and inclusion to drive institutional excellence. The AAMC is committed to serving as knowledge brokers, offering you the best content generated from within our network of relationships with thought leaders and practitioners. With this series, we bring this learning to your desktop or device for on-demand learning that suits any schedule. Visit us in the future for additional content, and thank you for watching. Welcome. It's really a privilege to have with us today Howard Ross, the author of Reinventing Diversity. Howard, welcome.
Thanks, Marc. It's good to be here.
Howard, I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book. Tell me a little bit about what's inside and what our readers can expect.
Well, Marc, I've been doing work in the field of diversity now professionally for almost 30 years and seen an incredible transition in this work and how much it's come into the mainstream of thought, both in businesses, corporations, healthcare, really in our society. 30 years ago when we started doing the work, people were wondering, why on earth businesses would be doing this, because it was seen mostly as a social justice issue. And of course, as a result of all the work that's been done, we've seen enormous changes, both societally and in business. But if we look at the last 10 years, what we see is sort of a disturbing trend, and that is there's a plateauing out. We've gotten to a certain level of success, but over time, that level of success is not rising as fast as we'd like to see it. And we know that there's still challenges. For example, the Office of Management and Budget did a survey back in 2010, evaluating the 10 years prior to that, which is probably the period of time when we spent the most money in diversity in our history. We've had more people going through diversity training, more Oprah shows about diversity, you name it. And yet, during that period of time, women's salary went from 79% of men's to 81%, and women in management from 40 to 41%. Now, at that rate, we'll achieve equity in about 2100. My oldest son is a cardiologist. He would say that's a patient who's practically flatlining. So the question I was asking myself was, given that we did all that work with the best of intention, we've had smart people, honorable people working really hard at it, what's getting in our way from taking it up to the next level? And that's where the whole concept of reinventing the way we approach the subject came from.
So what is getting in the way? That's an interesting, the idea that we've plateaued. What do you think is stopping us?
Well, what I've identified and what I talk about in the book are really three major paradigm shifts that are needed. The first one is that we've primarily, and especially in the United States, looked at this topic coming out of a social justice framework. And of course, social justice issues are still paramount, certainly to me and I think to most of us. We all believe that we have a society in which people should be treated fairly and equitably and in which everybody should have a chance to be successful. But a lot of the diversity and inclusion issues that we're facing are not about people consciously being discriminated against. They're more about things like a lack of understanding of culture and how it plays out, and how we create organizations in which some people are innately more able to be successful because the cultural model in the organization is more suited to their way of thinking, their way of being. We see that certainly in healthcare where patients are concerned, that we know that cultural competency has gone from something that just 10 years ago people were talking about as an interesting anomaly to something now that is in the forefront. The second is, and I think one of the most important, really relevant to the conversation about unconscious bias, is that we still sort of operate from a what I call a good person, bad person paradigm of diversity. And that is, they're the good people like you and I who really care about this subject, and then there are the bad people who do all the stuff that we read about. But our research shows that actually 90% of the things that happen in organizations on a daily basis that differentially impact one group versus another are caused not by people who are out to get somebody, but people, including all of us, who have blind spots. And those blind spots have us make decisions that aren't appropriate. And then the third is that mostly we still do diversity as an event-based approach. So you do diversity training, Black History Month, and International Food Day in the cafeteria, and you got a diversity program. But we know that any business initiative that we do that's done in that way will fail, or it will have minimal impact. So we have to really understand systems change and how to change organizational cultures. And I think that that's the big challenge for a lot of big organizations.
Those three paradigm shifts that you mentioned, really, really interesting and thought-provoking in many ways. Two, I find very salient to medical education and to healthcare broadly. Unconscious bias, and maybe we can start there and talk a little bit more about unconscious bias, but the cultural competency piece and the connection between the two as you see it would be really helpful for our audience, I believe.
Sure. You know, we're at a remarkable time in history, and that we're learning more about the mind and the brain, maybe in the last decade or 2 decades than we've ever known in history. Sure. You know, I mean, we still have a lot to learn about how the brain works, and a lot of brain scientists who I talk to will say that, you know, we know practically nothing really about how the brain works, but we're certainly getting a sense of how the mind works more than we've ever before. And what it's showing us is that that bias is as natural to human beings as breathing. You know, we determine on a daily basis, on a minute-by-minute basis, whether we're safe, whether we're not safe, whether a circumstance is right for us, whether it's not right for us. We make instant comparisons of things. You know, for example, we identify gray hair and age. You know, automatically we see somebody with gray hair, we generally think that they're getting older. We know that there are occasions when people are prematurely gray, but for the most part we associate those things in our mind. And we do that for a purpose. It allows us to navigate the world. But in the diversity and inclusion space, mostly we've taken the view that bias is a bad thing and needs to be driven out. Well, if we on one hand see that bias is natural to human functioning and that we can't function without it, and then we have a conversation that says you need to get rid of it, it's like telling somebody they need to stop breathing. You know, at the very best, what we'll do is get people to believe that they're not biased, but underneath the surface, those same functions are still going. And we have lots of research now that it shows that the way this plays itself out, you know, particularly in healthcare. You know, we have studies that show that people who are overweight get treated differently by doctors. We know that cardiologists have been shown to send patients to thrombolysis procedures at different rates when they have different experiences of those particular patients' racial identity. We know, for example, that a university in Canada did a study that showed that if a medical student is interviewing on a rainy day, the way they're rated is equivalent to them having a 10% lower score on the MCAT. So at every level of our functioning, we're seeing that these unconscious perceptions that we have impact the absolute results that we're showing out. And how that relates to culture is that, you know, we have a patient who comes in, and our natural tendency is to treat that patient like we would expect to be treated. You know, we were all raised on the golden rule. That's right. But we know that that in order to really treat a patient effectively, we have to develop a stronger sense of what some psychologists call theory of mind. That is, put ourselves in their head and understand what's important to them. So one of the examples, you know, just for example, that turned me on to this whole thing was about 10, 12 years ago maybe. Actually, it's more like 15 now that I think about it. I was working with a Midwest hospital system, and we were doing a training program, and one of the people who was working with us internally on the project, she had been trained to be an internal facilitator, was a woman named Bonnie Jacobs, who was an IT person, actually. She became fascinated with diversity, but her field was in information technologies. So she took it upon herself to do some research on patient outcomes in the hospital and found that Vietnamese women who came into the hospital to deliver babies were getting dehydrated more than any other group. And she talked to folks in OBGYN, and they had no idea why. So she started to do some research and found that, in fact, it was a generalized problem, not just in her hospital. So my son was in medical school here at Georgetown University at the time, and so I went with him to the medical school library one night and started doing some research in medical anthropology, and found that the reason had nothing to do with biology. It was totally cultural. That Vietnamese culture is based on hot and cold theory, which I'm sure many of our watchers and listeners know about, and that in traditional practice, labor and delivery is considered a cold time, and women are told to not to drink cold liquids or eat cold foods. But of course, what does a nurse bring to the bedside of a woman in labor? Ice chips and ice water. Right. So they don't drink it, they get dehydrated, it affects their health, delays lactation between the mom and the baby, and not only that, but extends the hospital stay, which has a financial implication. And for me, it was like lifting up a rock and finding a whole world underneath, you know. How many other things were there like this? And so that's led to, you know, now years of study for us in uncovering all of these kinds of dynamics.
I think the example you give is really important because it started with one person at the hospital. Yes. One person that was interested and curious about this. Yes. The question now, though, is how do we systematize these kinds of things? What should we be doing? The connection that you touched upon, this idea of cultural competency at the individual level is clearly important. But what about the institutional level? What does it mean for a hospital to be a culturally competent hospital? What does that look like, and how do we get to that point?
Well, I think it's a really important question, Mark, because if we look at the way a lot of institutions deal with these issues, the approach often is, let's see if we have somebody who can translate or somebody who can do this, which is a very different way of approaching it than having an institutional impact. I think one of the things that we need to look at first is the nature of the culture in some of the institutions we're talking about. You know, if we look at healthcare, and if we look at particularly healthcare education, you know, if we look at medical colleges and things like that, you've got a field, a body of study that requires people to develop a relatively high degree of confidence. You know, my son talks to me a lot about his medical education and talks about the fact that, you know, he's got to go out and work with patients, many of whom are seriously ill. He's an electrophysiologist, and you know, many of whom could die. And he says, you know, I can't be doubting myself all the time. And so there's almost like a trained arrogance, if you will, in the field because of that, which is completely understandable and reasonable. And then, of course, you add the academic side of that, in which we're taught in academia really from the neck up. You know, how much information can you have, and the currency of what we know is how we're measured. And so admitting that we don't know something is sort of anathema to the very structure of the culture and the norms of the cultures that we're a part of. So it's important, I think, for us to know that as we look at how do we approach this subject, because foundationally, when we approach cultural competency and unconscious bias, in my mind, it requires a certain level of humility. It requires us to know that the world as we see it may not actually be that way, that it may be affected by our past experiences, by the various lenses of experience that we have, the various things that have happened to us in the past, the relatively small amount that the brain allows us to see.
Sure.
You know, there are many researchers who say now that we're exposed to as many as 11 million pieces of information at any one time, and we can absorb about 50 of them. And so this phenomenon of selective attention or inattentional blindness occurs. This is the phenomenon that has pregnant women see pregnant women everywhere. That's or right. If we're thinking of buying a car, it seems like every time we turn around we see that car. That's right. So similarly, if a doctor or a nurse, for example, is working with a patient, they're going to spot the things that they're sensitized to by their experience. Right. And in that regard, they might miss things that are right in front of them but don't fit into that lens. Right. And when we add the whole lens of culture, and I mean culture in a really broad way, that is not just how do we kiss, bow, and shake hands and greet each other, but what are family patterns, food patterns? Are there traditional practices or medications that we use that might conflict with some of the ones that the doctor's giving us? Are there various kinds of things that we don't understand about the ethnopharmacological impact of certain drugs that a person may take based on genetic polymorphisms that come through their genetic strain? You know, all of these factors ranging from our interactional to the deep chemical aspects of what we're dealing with. And so it's a very rich field and really a fascinating one.
Absolutely. You know, and it's interesting in hearing you talk about it because it seems like there's actually an ability to harness those differences of experiences and attributes and perspectives that people bring to the table, that it's not all negative, as you said, that it's not a good guy, bad guy situation, but how do we harness it? How do we as institutions, what are the structures and kinds of policies you've seen to be effective in really harnessing those differences to have either better patient care, better medical education experience, or just to really achieve those business outcomes that we have?
Well, one thing is we have to make people aware of these distinctions and transform the way they're looking at them, because when we all know that giving people information is not just the answer. I mean, you know, I had struggled with my weight most of my life, and you know, I could write books about dieting, and when I was overweight it didn't help me at all. You know, not that it's that complex anyway. You eat less and you exercise more, but the point is, having that information wasn't the answer. There was something that had me be able to finally, you know, feel like I was a little bit on top of it, and that was understanding why I eat. I think similarly, a lot of times we look for the information, give me the information, but that doesn't change our behavior. And so the first thing that we need to do is to help people understand the dynamics of how we think, and to recognize and to accept that we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And so therefore, in order for us to be able to relate to a patient or to create a structure or system that affects a broad range of patients or relates to the community, we have to be able to say, okay, where am I making this decision from, and are there other alternatives to that? So the first body of work we find is in educating people on some of these distinctions of unconscious bias and the way the mind works, and also the way the organizational unconscious works, so that we can see that these are pattern behaviors that have come over time that make us very robotic. And then once we've done that, and people get the aha, if you will, of seeing that that, wow, this is important for us to focus on, and maybe I am doing things without realizing it, then we can go to the next level. Now, one thing that I think is really important in that part of the equation, Marc, is that we reduce the level of guilt that people feel about this and increase their level of responsibility. If we think about the way diversity has mostly been practiced, the currency of guilt has been a big piece of it. I go back to the long time ago to the trainings where we used to kind of beat people over the head with a 2x4 until, especially people who looked like this, and then wait for somebody to have a cathartic moment where they would cry or something, and everybody felt better. But the reality was, what I found was, if you talked to that person a month later, they didn't want to have anything to do with diversity ever again, because they felt contracted and small from the experience. We want to get people to see is that, this isn't about being a bad person. It's just about understanding that you may not see the world in the way other people do, or you may not see some of the dimensions that affect other people. And if we come into that with that kind of intellectual humility, then we're much more open to it. Then once we've done that, then we can begin to look at structures and systems. So for example, we find in the hiring process, let's say, that just taking a few minutes, and once people have these distinctions and they understand them, that taking 5 or 10 minutes before you start to do an interview and glancing through that resume in front of you and saying to yourself, where might I have biases? And what school they went to, or what their name is, or anything else. Could there potentially be biases there? Just asking yourselves the question, building structured questions that people ask themselves, can move the needle significantly to have people make better decisions. And the important thing for people to realize is that when we make these decisions, it's not just a matter of equity, it's not just a matter of people being treated fairly, but we make better talent management decisions. We hire people who are more suited to the organization. We're far more likely to keep those people because they're more suited in the organization. We do a better job of treating our patients, and our patients get well faster. At every level, these are performance-based things that play out. And then, of course, on the other side, we want to be sure to put in the kind of metrics that allow us to watch and see whether, in fact, those patterns of behavior are changing.
It'd be great if you could talk a little bit about the metrics. I think that's a topic that a lot of folks in our audience are really interested in. What are we measuring? How do we know if we're making change, if we're making progress? What are those metrics?
Well, one of the things is I think we have to look at our relationship with metrics before we even look at the specifics. In a lot of cases, if we think about diversity and inclusion, we've had one basic metric, which is how many people like you are there around. That's right. It's been basically the E&O numbers, our levels of participation that we have in the system, what kind of representation do we have of certain numbers of people. And so as a result of that, we've had some pretty, backwards kind of behavior. So I know organizations, for example, where they set a target and they said, we'll give leaders bonuses if they hire a certain number of people. And 6 months will go by during that year, and at some point people will say, that bonus is going to mean something to me. I better hire somebody. So I'll look and I'll find, well, there's Marc, he's black, I'll bring him in, which obviously doesn't work. So what we do is we work with organizations to develop what we call batches of metrics, and they can work throughout the system. But just to give you an example, let's say we are trying to increase our representation. Rather than just saying we'll hire somebody of that group, we may look at the 4 metrics, say the pipeline measurements, the number of people who apply for a job, the percentage of people who are offered jobs, the percentage of people who accept those jobs, and then the percentage of those people who are successful after 6 months on the job based on whatever performance review we have. So let's say our target is 25%, and we say only 15% are applying for jobs. Then we know we've got to spread the net wider, we've got to tap into some new communication streams. We may, if we're using executive search firms, we may need to get a different executive search firm. We get those numbers up to 25. Now let's say 25% apply for jobs, but only 15% are hired jobs. Well then, likely either we're not getting the right people to apply, or there's something differential happening in the hiring process, okay? Let's say we get that up to 25%, but only 15% accept the jobs. Then there's likely something in our interview process that's turning people off, and we're not even aware of it. 25% accept the jobs, but only 15% are making it after 6 months. Then we need to look at our onboarding process, on our on-the-job training, on the culture and how it's affecting people's ability to be successful. But the key in doing this, in creating these batching systems, is that the way we've often done diversity is we've got a problem, we say, well, the hospital down the street is doing it this way, we'll try that. It's sort of like if my car broke down on the side of the road, and we would say, well, my friend's car broke down and I changed the tire, so I'll change my tires and see if it works. This way it allows us to say, the problem's in a catalytic converter. And we can focus where the problem is and more likely get a chance to get the results. So the organizations that I'm looking at that are best in class are organizations that are beginning to develop those kind of dashboards in very sophisticated ways.
That's fantastic. This idea of differentiation, if you will, of by hospital, or it could be by institution, medical school, whatever the like. The idea to really look inward and to have some metrics to know what's really stopping you from making the progress that you want is really critical. So I appreciate that. Just want to pivot a little bit, because I think we're at an inflection point with diversity, inclusion, and healthcare, and in a positive way. And I'd like to sort of get your reaction to this. Healthcare reform, for example, allows us to stop thinking about healthcare as this episodic care or a volume-based care. So you as a practitioner are going to get paid or remunerated for the value you can provide, not only the volume of care. I think that has real opportunity, that offers real opportunity for the concepts that you're talking about, diversity and inclusion. How do we measure the value in the patient-provider experience? Are we looking at those things? Are some of your clients looking at these things? What would you measure if you had to think about, now it's a value-based system, what's the value that diversity and inclusion is providing the patient? Or again, it could just be more broader in terms of what is it really bringing to the table for the bottom line? How does it improve the bottom line?
Well, I would think that, if we were to look at healthcare and how it's evolved over the last couple of generations, if we go back to the early 80s, for example, when DRGs were first introduced, which radically altered the way people were doing healthcare, obviously, the designated regulated guidelines. Before that, one could build a case that value was what we looked for. We looked for, did the patient get well, was the patient taken care of, because price was sort of a secondary consideration. When we made those changes, and obviously there were good reasons to make those changes. There was concern about healthcare costs, and a lot of people at the time thought that was a way to deal with it. But what we did was we shifted that. We moved from the background, the cost equation, to the foreground, and then all of a sudden cost became an issue. And so when we have cost, we start to say, okay, how do we become more productive? Well, we have more productive by saying that doctors should spend 7.2 minutes with each patient, for example. Makes a lot of sense from the standpoint of productivity management, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for good medicine. And when we look at some of the issues we're talking about, for example, we know that the faster a doctor has to operate in situations, for example, when you're in the emergency room and you've got major problems, you've got triage on a lot of patients, you've got patients lined up, you've got to do quick kinds of things. Doctors not likely to sit over a patient and say, all right, now, what am I thinking about here? What am I reacting? They're going to go in and solve that problem. And in a lot of cases, they have to. They don't have the time for that. If you only got 7.5 minutes with a patient, you're not going to have a lot of time to get to know the patient, have a conversation with the patient. And we know that bias, accelerates dramatically with shorter periods of time. That the longer period of time a doctor gets to know a patient, or for that matter, a nurse or a physician's assistant or any other practitioner, the longer period of time we get to know you, talk to you, understand where you're coming from, get your perspective, a number of things start to happen. First of all, from the patient's perspective, we know that I start to trust you more as a patient. Absolutely. I start to feel more comfortable with you. I start to feel safer to share with you some of the personal aspects of my life. I have a little time to think about some of the connections to what's going on with me that I might not think about in a very quick period of time. From the doctor's standpoint, I begin to develop more of that sense of what's going on in your head. I begin to develop a sense of understanding what you're really telling me, which may not sound like I've heard it from somebody else, because the way you speak may be, and I don't just mean language and accent, although those are factors as well, but the kinds of things you talk about may not approach the problem from the same way I would approach the problem. But with enough time, I begin to say, oh, I see what you're saying. So our structure and system needs to recognize that. And when we have an opportunity to look at value proposition rather than just cost proposition, and that our job is really to heal the patient, then taking a little longer with that patient, or even substantially longer in some cases, is worthwhile, because it helps get us to that result.
Excellent. So I'm curious about one thing from your experience. What's the role of leadership in making all of this happen, whether at a hospital or any of your clients? Tell me about leadership and diversity and inclusion.
Well, look, I think in any circumstance in life, leaders create meaning. That's what a good leader does. Sure. Their main job is to create meaning. The questions that leaders ask, the things that they look at, the things that they hold people accountable for, the place they invest the resources of the organization, all of these things create meaning in an organization. And the human mind is fundamentally about creating meaning in the world that we see. So if a leader says to me, have you thought about the diversity on your team, all of a sudden the diversity on my team becomes important. If a leader says to me, I looked at our patient outcomes and I noticed that African Americans are performing at or showing outcomes at a lower level than Caucasians, or that there are disparities between the way Latinos are doing, who come into our hospital, than other groups, then all of a sudden I'm paying attention to those things. And so one thing is that just having an understanding of the importance of this and speaking it at the first blush is the most important thing a leader can do. Secondly, if a leader begins to demonstrate in their own behavior that they're willing to acknowledge that they may have blind spots, that they don't see everything, and that they can learn from the people around them, that they can learn from patients and family members of patients, and learn from studying about the culture of a particular patient group that we're dealing with, then once again, that becomes something that's important to people. And then finally, the hardcore resources that a leader devotes to this. And that means not just money, putting into time to, have positions in cultural competency, or deliver training programs or education programs, or have tools that practitioners can use, because we know that just knowing, for example, that unconscious bias or cultural competency or issues doesn't mean that on a moment-by-moment basis, if you're somebody, one of my clients has here in the city told me one time that they had something like 117 different countries come into their hospital in 1 year. Well, nobody's going to remember all that stuff, so we have to build some tools. And as you know, we created a tool called Culture Vision, for example, to help practitioners know how to get culture-based information about patients at a moment-by-moment basis. So it's a combination of the setting the tone, developing their own awareness, and then marshaling the resources in the right direction.
There's one thing I always appreciate about talking and speaking with you about these issues, and it's that you're always optimistic. You've been doing this work for 30 years, and you seem more optimistic than ever before, and I think we share that. Tell me why you're so optimistic about the future.
Well, we have an interesting culture we're in right now. We tend to look at things very differently because we're in this 24/7 news cycle. So for example, it's a little bit of a sidebar, but for example, a lot of people you talk to say, we're living in the most violent time of human history. The exact opposite is true. When you look at, Steven Pinker at Harvard talks a lot about this. When you actually look at what's going on in the world today, fewer people are going to die from violence on the planet today, or this decade, than ever before in human history. And I think this is the same about diversity and inclusion. We hear about the breakdowns a lot, but when we think about what's actually going on, the number of people who are paying attention to this issue, the number of people who are devoting their resources to this issue, the number of people who take this seriously as opposed to seeing it as this side thing that we do to sing Kumbaya together or something, is dramatically increasing. And in addition to that, the hard science of it is filling in some of the gaps. So we've known, for example, about bias for years and years and years. But now we've got, hundreds of scientific studies that now show us the way this plays out. We can now apply hard science to things that before we just speculated about.
Absolutely.
And now, I have to say, to some degree, that can be challenging to us too. When I was writing the book, I probably read 200 different studies about unconscious bias, and at some point I was sitting at my desk and I pushed back and kind of said, how do I know anything about what I'm doing? So it's a little bit challenging to our ego structure because we like to think that we know everything.
That's right.
The reality, of course, is that we don't. And the more that we accept that we've got these blind spots, the more that we accept that we do have biases, the more likely we are to be able to manage them and deal with them effectively.
Yep. Howard, thank you so much for sharing with us today. This has been phenomenal for me personally, but I know for many of our viewers today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Marc. It's been a pleasure.
Been wonderful. Yeah. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Howard Ross. Again, the book is Reinventing Diversity, a phenomenal read. I really highly suggest you get this book. For more information, go to AAMC.org/diversity. Thank you again.